Okay, let's just jump right into it. Today, we're unpacking a truly fascinating concept. In this explainer, how a single, seemingly isolated action can fundamentally reshape the entire world around us. We'll briefly look at the original Networks of Life essay, which digs into these wild chain reactions in nature and society. And then, we're going to review a really thought-provoking critique of it that traces those very same ripples through one of America's most famous and talked about families. So, here is our roadmap. We'll start off with a pebble in the lake metaphor, take a look at nature's chain reactions, and examine some unintended human consequences. Then we'll trace the Prohibition ripple effect, follow the Kennedy connections, and finally ask, are we witnessing a new noble experiment today? All right, Section 1, the pebble in the lake. Let's look at how actions transform systems. We have to start with the foundational essay's core thesis, which asks a pretty profound question. How do organisms, environments, and massive systems actually transform each other? Well, the author uses this perfect, simple metaphor. Imagine dropping a pebble into a small, still lake. Those concentric waves move all the way across the surface, eventually disrupting locations way on the other side. Our interdependent world works exactly like that. A change over here inevitably leads to consequences, some intended, some definitely not, over there.
And this is a brilliant illustration of that point. In science, a discovery in one super niche area almost always finds a vital use somewhere else. Take atomic clocks. They are the most precise clocks on Earth, and they rely on quantum theory just to measure time. But those exact same quantum concepts, they acted like the pebble in the lake. They created a ripple effect that ultimately made global banking transactions in electron microscopes way more accurate. It's wild to think about, right? There is a direct line from theoretical physics to how securely your bank processes your data. Let's move to Section 2, Nature's Chain Reactions, and see what happens when we observe Mother Nature's complex web. We know that consequences can be completely unpredictable, and reintroductions in nature are especially tricky. But look at this multi-step transformation. When the National Park Service decided to reintroduce wolves into Yellowstone, that was the pebble. The ripple? Well, the elk population naturally shifted to escape those new predators. And because the elk moved, willow trees actually began to survive longer. Those mature willows allowed beavers to flourish and build dams. The dams provided cool, shaded water, and as a direct result, populations of fish and songbirds absolutely exploded. It's an incredible display of systemic interdependence.
But nature's ripples aren't always so harmonious. Conversely, let's look at a well-intentioned human intervention. During the Great Depression, the Civilian Conservation Corps paid workers to plant the Asian kudzu vine across the American South. The intended consequence was great: combat massive soil erosion. The unintended consequence? Well, introducing a foreign, fast-growing invasive species has some severe repercussions. It literally became known as the vine that ate the South. It climbed over native trees and shrubs, completely blocked their sunlight, and suffocated entire forests. Which brings us to Section 3, Unintended Human Consequences. Solving one problem often creates a brand new one. The crucial point here is that human transformations are incredibly susceptible to these unpredictable ripple effects. A really striking example from the essay is the mandate for football players to wear helmets. Now, as the critique notes, nobody wants football players suffering cracked skulls, right? Going backwards isn't the answer. The intended consequence of protecting skulls was 100% achieved. But the unintended consequence, brains are now being shaken around like eggs inside a shell, which led to a massive increase in concussions and chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE. The intervention solved one massive, visible problem, but inadvertently illuminated a hidden, devastating one. Now we hit Section 4, the Prohibition ripple effect. The critique pivots beautifully to the 18th Amendment. Banning the manufacture, sale, or distribution of alcohol in the U.S. was a monumental pebble dropped into the American lake. Documentary filmmaker Ken Burns aptly titled his whole series on prohibition The Noble Experiment. And that's really what it was: the United States' earnest, sweeping attempt to cure what many viewed as a crippling societal scourge. And sure, the intended consequence actually succeeded to a degree. Crimes directly associated with alcohol use did decline. But the unintended consequences? Explosive. Crimes associated with the manufacture and distribution of alcohol skyrocketed. Organized criminal syndicates literally developed overnight just to smuggle liquor, and murderous, powerful groups fought bloody battles for dominance. The critique points out that this experiment created a whole host of secondary problems that most people ultimately deemed way worse than just letting people drink. Let's look at Section 5, the Kennedy connections, tracing this historical thread to one specific family. The critique asks a very direct question. How did Prohibition actually shape the fortune and legacy of the Kennedys? It looks squarely at the patriarch, Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. Was he a bootlegger? Well, the experts are split. Historians David Nassau and Daniel Okrent argue that, honestly, no hard evidence has ever been found to support the claim. But, on the other hand, journalist T.J. English asserts that, of course, he was. The critique's author makes a really astute observation here, though. In science, absence of evidence is not absolute evidence of absence. The entire point of bootlegging was to be covert and avoid leaving a paper trail. Whether it's true or not, it forces us to look at the family's overall trajectory. Because history tells us that Patrick J. Kennedy, that's Joseph P. Kennedy Sr.'s father, was in the liquor business way before Prohibition even started. So the critique asks, how did Prohibition, bootlegging or not, shape the family fortune and ultimately set the course for John F. Kennedy to become the 35th president? And look at the ripples of that presidency. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, we came terrifyingly close to all-out nuclear war. If JFK's cooler heads and open communication hadn't prevailed, the author asks if we'd even be around today to debate this stuff. And that historical timeline extends right up to the modern day with Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Which brings us full circle to Section 6, a new noble experiment. We are looking at a modern-day transformation in food regulation. Fast forward to right now. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is the Secretary of Health and Human Services, sworn in early in 2025. And we can clearly track this rapid timeline of his efforts. Within a month, he directed the FDA to explore rulemaking to eliminate a major regulatory pathway. And by the summer of 2026, proposed changes to this pathway were officially announced, alongside a push to get voluntary phase-outs of certain food additives and dyes. The main target of this regulatory push is what's known as GRAS, or generally recognized as safe. Basically, it's a self-affirmed regulatory pathway for food additives that has been an absolute staple of the food industry for decades. Kennedy's directive to the FDA to explore eliminating this pathway represents a massive, systemic shift in how food ingredients are assessed and allowed onto grocery store shelves. Now, what's super interesting is the strategy outlined in the source material. The federal government is attempting to fundamentally change the incentives and the information structure of the American food industry. The critique notes that they are doing this by relying heavily on encouraging voluntary phase-outs of these additives rather than just imposing outright bans on products that consumers want to buy. It's a structural nudge rather than a blunt force prohibition. So as we wrap up this explainer, the critique leaves us with a really profound set of questions to chew on. Is this approach to food additives a new noble experiment? Can the government actually change these massive structures without simply banning products? Just like the pebble in the lake, or the wolves in Yellowstone, or the 18th Amendment, we have to ask, are we coming full circle? And as these new waves ripple outward, what known and completely unknown repercussions will they bring? It's a powerful reminder that in the networks of life, absolutely no action happens in isolation. Thanks so much for exploring this with me today.